I've been writing this story for 4 years.
Have you?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Well, it went dormant for probably 2 of those 4 years. So I started writing this one in 2016.
Oh, okay.
And I probably got, I don't know, 15, 20,000 words in. Well, maybe not that many, about 15,000 words in. And then it just like went dormant because I started working on contemporary fiction. And then I kind of got to a point where like all these other story ideas were coming to me in like snowballs. And I'm like, okay, there's just too much noise. Because I know it can be like really, you really want to follow all of the rabbit trails, but if you follow all the rabbit trails, nothing will get finished. So I was trying to be as like open with the creative flow as I could, but within the parameters of like, these are the 2 projects that I've got going on. I've got the contemporary fiction and I've got the fantasy series. And part of why it went dormant for 2 years was because it was the first thing I started writing. And when I first started writing, I was like, wow, I don't have the skill. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I felt like I didn't know enough to write the book yet, but
Mm-hmm.
that I would want to eventually finish it, which kind of ended up being the justification for swinging over to the contemporary fiction. I'm like, I can justify this. I'm not a good enough writer to write this fantasy book yet. So I spent 2 years intermittently drafting up the contemporary fiction. And like, I feel like a lot of writers probably can relate to this.
Oh,
All the books,
totally. Yeah.
well, how like you're starting to write a story and then like it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And you're like, wow, this is an amalgamation of a lot of things. Where do I rein it in?
And
And so,
I think you just don't until you feel like the full story has been allowed to be a little bit wild and unruly. Yeah, because like I did something similar when I finished Noimiad or the Timekeepers. As soon as I started taking more writing classes and just said, okay, I'm going to be a published author and this is going to happen in X amount of years. I was like, okay, well, there are a lot of things that work for playwriting, and poetry, but they do not work for fiction or prose. And I just really need to hunker down and basically get an MFA, which of course was impossible for me to do because I was working full time in a foreign country. Which there were online MFAs, but they were just way too expensive. And so I was like, I'm just going to do a DIY MFA. I said, for each hour that I write, I need to do 2 hours of reading so that I'm able to understand the structure of how fiction works in terms of like whether it's following a 3-act structure or another, and then like voice. Like I felt like I was not really good about capturing voice unless it was in dialogue. There were just so many things that I just was like, study, study, study. So I wrote in 2 years, I wrote 3 books and short stories too. Like I was just writing all the time. But I also was in a lot of pain. And it was really, really hard for me to do a lot of social things. And so I could use pain and writing as an excuse to not like socialize. So
yeah.
I'd come home, I'd go to bed for like an hour, I'd wake up, I'd write, go to bed again, wake up at like right at the moment that I could like be semi ready for work, hop in the car, drive for an hour to get to work, and just repeat that Monday through Friday. And then bank in like 5 hours on Saturday, 5 hours on Sunday. Sometimes skip church like a bad girl.
So I think it sounds like you've experienced kind of the full spectrum of like what it looks like to be maybe operating in an unhealthy space for creativity. And then like now I'm guessing have found a better process for yourself.
Oh yeah, because I was like horribly depressed then. And
Mm,
like writing was the only thing that made me feel alive. And I just got to the point where it wasn't fun to watch television anymore.
yeah.
And in Germany, as a foreigner, there aren't, like, I lived in a small village. There weren't a ton of social opportunities until I had been living there long enough and spoke enough German that I was like, oh, I should try to have a social life.
Yeah. I've only ever lived in an English speaking country, and my social life is quite small, but I'm okay with that.
But honestly, like, I think if you want to be a good artist and you don't want to do drugs, you kind of have to have you have to think about, like, okay, what am I
Where are you
able to
spending your
do?
time? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not sustainable to, live off of methamphetamines. So, or uppers or whatever to keep yourself going. So I think that whole structure of just kind of writing a lot of different things, because you're just trying to figure out, like, what kind of writing do I enjoy and can I sustain? And I was very
Yeah.
much running away from big, complicated stories.
I'm like, sign me up for the big complicated stories. Go. Yeah. The more tangled and messy, the better.
Yep,
Oh,
basically. Yep, that's
that's
me.
but I love what writing can give back. I feel like it can be a very grounding practice. And I think it's made me more compassionate. Like I'm better able to relate to other people. I mean, I've
Mhm.
always been deeply empathetic, but that doesn't mean like being a deeply empathetic person does not always translate to being a good communicator with words out loud. And so I think like there's definitely a connection for writing dialogue and like letting your characters feel what they're feeling and like figuring it out. I feel like it can translate to real life and how you communicate with people.
Oh, I definitely think so. And I like the like experience of getting feedback from you and from other like writers that are in the trenches, like with the class that I'm taking right now. It's so helpful to have kind of like that renewal. And also I feel like we feel more bonded to each other because there always is a little bit of something of me in my stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to kind of tease it out so it's not terribly recognizable. People who know me well, like my editor Brad, he's like, "Hey, that part's you, baby, right there."
Like,
Although he's never called me baby, so because that would be weird.
oh man, yeah. Like, I think that was what was starting to happen a couple of years ago when I was first beginning to write. I was like giving my characters the same like pets that I had growing up, like just like things that now that I'm this far in the process and I like think about it, I'm like, that character would not have that for a pet. Like that doesn't make sense for this character or for the world that I'm building for that matter. So yeah. Um, but of course, like every character we write, like even the villains, even the jerks, even the, narcissists, like it's all going to have some tiny piece of at least what's come out of your brain. It may not be like you and your identity, but it's still you. So it's like you almost have to pull out the pieces that are your identity when it comes to the storytelling piece. But that doesn't mean that you can't talk about the things that make you you. It's a weird like
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point because, like, I think I spent a lot of my early young life running away from who I was, especially because and I was on stage from a really young age. And as an actor, you're kind of told to, like, depending on which school of acting, to kind of delete yourself so that you can become this other person.
mhm.
And some schools of acting are like, no, you just bring out who you are. But, like, I didn't really know who I was. And so which is kind of a, now when I think about it, I'm like, of course you knew who you were, but you just weren't comfortable. You know, you had been told so many different things about what identity was. And so I think with characters for a long time, that early writing still shows that like trying to run away. But once I was like, oh, I can actually take this experience and it relates to my character, and then I could eventually make it the characters. And I think that's the fun thing about just saying, okay, I'm going to sit with my characters in this space and I'm going to ask them, what do they want? And I'm going to channel them like spirits from the deep.
Yeah. I feel like that's when like people who don't like who aren't kind of living in that creative flow or who haven't ever tapped into it and like felt that experience of like the work just flowing out. It sounds a little woo woo, like what we do here. You know, taking these imaginary people that live in our brains and we throw them into situations, sometimes really terrible situations, and we make them suffer. And then out of that comes like this story.
Oh yeah.
It sounds crazy when you think about it like that, but I think like that's the magic of writing. It's the magic of creating something, some kind of art. Like you can tell I've been living in that space for a little bit because I can't even properly articulate it. Like what it feels like to like, I don't know. And it's hard to get to that state of mind where you can tap into that, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, like the struggle for me is I'm so much an artist and have always been able to kind of work as an artist, even as a teacher. And so the last 2 years of having a book come out and then another one, um, and doing that process a little faster than I should have, as we talked about last time we met.
18 months, not
18
12 months.
months. Yeah, 18 months. And like there are things about me that I'm not really good about talking about myself in a public forum where I don't have control about where it's going to go. So like press releases, I am a nightmare because I'm like, how do I talk about my own work? And luckily I have a small team that they help with that. And they're like, oh, let's tweak that. Let's tweak this side. You know, I actually added you to the press release, by the way.
What does that mean?
Your review of that was on Goodreads.
Oh, yay.
So you're right here at the bottom.
Hit me.
Yay. Yeah, I was like, ooh, I think I need some more. I'm going to switch out some quotes that we have here because I was using like some earlier quotes for Loyaborn. And then eventually when I have enough quotes for Hirana's War, we'll update it with the quotes for Hirana's War. But that's for, you know, eventual. But like, yeah, I mean, like, how do I write about my own book? And like, Hirana's War is a wonderfully complex novel about living with disability, overcoming the ravages of war, and finding hope in the most unusual of places.
And it's super awkward because you like wrote the book and now you have to talk about it as if you're not the author of the book. Like,
yeah,
it's sort of like yeah, it's very awkward.
It is. And like,
to put that hat on and to write like that about your own work.
It is. And like a lot of writers are being asked to do that. Like they don't necessarily.
So it's like if you don't have marketing experience, then like you're just at a huge deficit.
Basically.
Yeah.
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 So like I took like I had done a little bit of marketing, PR, not much, but it was still difficult. And so I of course hired someone to help me with that piece. But I also looked at like what are publishers sending out for their press releases, like ones that publish speculative fiction. And like in my inbox, miracles of miracles, I got a request for me to review a book from an author. And the publisher sent me the press release and the author letter and all this stuff. And I was like, this is very helpful. Thank you. And so
Yeah,
I
because
just,
it's like that's the stuff that you don't like. How else are you going to know unless you stumble upon it? It's not like that stuff is like, this is an example of a press release for writing about yourself and your work. Like, that's why there are so many classes out there that help teach authors to do that, because it's not part of the actual novel writing process. But it's so essential to bringing your book to the market. And
and
I feel
if,
like that's something people
yeah,
don't realize. Like, it's on the author to do that work.
it really is, unless you're like a featured title. And then they'll still say to you, hey, you know, this is what we've written, and now we need you to like put in your 2 cents about what you think is sellable about your book. And you're like, um, they're cool animals. Um,
The landscape is really pretty.
there's great
Stuff
romance.
happens. You
Exactly.
might cry a little bit. I don't know.
Like I mean, and one of like, and I'll think about like what's the most recent emotional thing I had from reading it, which was like the moments with Selçuk and Leonora, where I just feel his like pain so intensely. And like even had moments where I'm like crying as I'm like revising. I'm just like, get a grip, Brita. Finish revising. But like the reason I felt weird about the fact I was crying wasn't because I didn't think it was important, but because I was afraid that I might be the only one crying about that part of the book. So you can see how slightly twisted my brain is and why I was terrified to write a press release, because this brain is great for doing things like writing high fantasy and high science fiction. This is not necessarily the brain for writing press releases. And so I think because I was such a good student, and I knew that like hard work was pretty much 90% of the battle. I was like, I'm just going to like research and look at what all of these different things look like. Then once I've done all the work I can do, I'll ask and pay an expert to tweak it for me. And I think
Is
if,
it easy enough to find that stuff out there? Like, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Like, I guess some authors put their press kits on their websites.
yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I think I have mine on my website. Thanks for reminding me. I need to update it.
Yay, you're welcome.
Update press kit. Yeah. Yeah. Usually your publisher will help with some aspect of that.
Mhm.
You'll also need to be able to tweak things for different, like, especially if you're writing for children, or you're planning to do
Children should not read my book.
they will anyway.
I mean, that's fine, but I am not marketing it for children.
Yes. And
Please
that's,
continue.
yes. And that's a good point. If you're going to have like an event, like you want to pitch yourself for events because it's helpful.
What does that
Having,
mean?
you email a
Pitch yourself
library
for an event. Oh, cool.
or like WorldCon. Like I pitched myself to WorldCon before, like 2 years before Aloya Born was coming out. Cause I was like, oh, I'm supposed to go to WorldCon because that's where I'm going to meet all the other writers that write speculative fiction. So I should see if I can't do a book talk, not a book talk, but a presentation about young adult literature and how science fiction really contributes to help struggling young adult readers. And
Cool.
so, and I, pitched the idea to them, didn't hear anything at all. And then all of a sudden, 3 weeks before the conference, they write to me and say, oh no, it was like a month, and it was like the second to the last day of school. I just scroll and open my personal email, and they're like, "Oh, we would love for you to give your presentation. da 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 da. And I'm like, oh no, let me backtrack. They had invited me and I had ignored it because I was afraid. Because I was like, who am I to give this presentation? Which is like just, it's complete crap that I would act that way. And so I ignored it. And then they put me on the schedule and then they told me. So I'm
mean,
like,
I don't feel like I love that happened that way, but it sort of had to light a fire under you because your name was attached.
oh, totally, totally. And so I show my colleague, my favorite colleague, Jamie, like we're sitting on the bleachers at school. And I'm like cursing and I'm like, I have to give a presentation in Finland. What am I going to do? And she's like, you're going to do it because you're an author and that's what you do, Britta. And so you're going to do it. I was like, but I ignored the email where they wanted me to confirm. And so it was great because like I spent the next 3 weeks tweaking that damn presentation. And it was great because like I went to the conference, I'm sitting in the green room. There's an astronaut in the green room named Shell something, Kjel. Can't remember his last name. He was awesome. And I'm like, I'm shaking the hand of an astronaut. I'm going to act very
You've been
cool.
in space.
I was like, this is an astronaut. He's very tall. Okay. And I'm like listening to the other presenters and they're like, yeah, I just did my presentation last night because, I had too much to drink. And meanwhile, I've done like 5 iterations of my presentation and have been like passing out cards to people so they'll come. So I have at least like 15 people show up. So all that hard work has like been for something.
Hey, you were doing your due diligence. Everybody has their own process.
Yeah. Well, it was great though, because then when I gave the presentation, I was really, I was like really calm because I was so prepared and I got to make like a lot of great friends as a result. Like the rest of the conference, I had drinking buddies, even though we both know that I don't drink alcohol. So it was like,
You had some social buddies.
back.
I'll make sure you get home safe tonight.
Basically. But it was fun. I mean, and so I think that's the other thing is that like part of that whole writing process is you just make really great friends, especially at conferences. Like Worldcon next year, I think it'll be in DC. Totally gonna go. I think I'm gonna drag you there. You're coming.
I mean, if COVID allows, I'm all for it.
Then we're gonna go to the online version then.
Okay.